So why don't we go ahead and get started with the introduction? And I wanted to start off by welcoming everyone to today's webinar. This is the series entitled Challenges in Pediatric Neuroscience Research. My name is Adam Hartman. I'm one of the program directors in the Division of Clinical Research at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, which is one of the institutes at the U.S. National Institutes of Health. I'm also a practicing child neurologist and epileptologist. My co-host today is Dr. Christy Hardy, who's a pediatric neuropsychologist, if you want to wave Christy. She's also a program director in the Division of Clinical Research. Christy and I have a number of pediatric clinical studies and other human subject studies in our portfolios. We created the series to help investigators overcome some of the challenges that they might face in pediatric neuroscience, including many areas like neurology, neurosurgery, psychiatry, psychology, neurodevelopmental disabilities, physiatry, critical care, emergency medicine, pathology, radiology, and pharmacology, just to name a few. There are many others. Our ultimate goal is to improve the quality of care for our patients, but the more proximal goal is to enhance research that will facilitate improvements in practice. Our webinars are targeted to trainees, senior investigators, and even those who are not currently involved in research, making the pie bigger, so to speak. So today we're hosting Dr. Heather Hazlett, a pediatric neuropsychologist from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who will be discussing remote assessments in pediatric neuroscience studies. As you'll see, the discussion will address a topic at many levels in a very thoughtful way. First, a few technical notes about the webinar. Alva, if you could advance to the next slide. So the session's being recorded and will be transcribed in archives, archived on the NINDS website. Details about where to find the archive version will be posted on social media and professional society listservs and newsletters. There will be a question and answer segment at the end. So if you want to ask a question, you can either click on the ellipsis near the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A, or open the participant window and on the bottom right, find the Q&A area. So to repeat, if you have a question for Dr. Hazlett, please either click on the ellipsis near the bottom of the screen, click on Q&A, or open the participant window on the bottom right, find the Q&A area. Christy and I will moderate the question period. I wanted to thank our partners, Dr. Alvaro Sinos, Dr. Lena Garcia for their help, with technical support coordinating the webinar, and the NINDS Office of the Scientific Liaison for all of its support and publicity. So let's get started. Our guest today is Dr. Heather Hazlett, who is a psychologist with over 20 years of experience in child neuropsychology and neurodevelopmental disorders. She's on the faculty in the Department of Psychiatry at UNC Chapel Hill and at the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disorders. Dr. Hazlett's primary research is focused on learning about brain development in autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. Dr. Hazlett uses measures from brain MRI scans and psychological assessments to test relationships between brain and cognition. Currently, Dr. Hazlett is the principal investigator or a collaborator on several projects using neuroimaging to study the brain development in autism spectrum disorder, Angelman syndrome, and Down syndrome. Dr. Hazlett has co-authored over 90 peer-reviewed research articles and has authored numerous book chapters. In addition to her research activities, Dr. Hazlett is a board-licensed psychologist who spends her clinical time in a pediatric neuropsychology clinic, a diagnostic clinic for autism spectrum disorders, and a multidisciplinary clinic for neurogenetic syndromes. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you, Adam. And I just wanted to say thank you to you and Christy for your invitation to come and speak in your webinar series today. And I'm happy to begin, and I hope I saved plenty of room for discussion, because that's always the most fun for me, the most interesting part. I will share my screen and get us started. So again, welcome everyone. I believe there's going to be time for questions at the end, but I'm going to be speaking today about remote assessment, sort of where we are in the field, and maybe more the challenges that we're facing in the field related to remote assessment. Let me get my slides to advance. There we go. So remote phenotyping is kind of a broad word, and it can mean a lot of different things. And actually, it includes some things that I'm quite sure that people are already doing, and they have been doing for quite some time. And that's, sending out paper or online questionnaires. That is a form of remote phenotyping. People have also been doing home assessments, getting recordings of observations at home, parents sending in home recordings. That has been done for quite some time, interviews, phone interviews, home visits. But I think probably what has captured everyone's attention and angst has been virtual assessments and observations that are conducted over telehealth. So I'm going to spend the majority of our time today talking about that component. But I just wanted to acknowledge that remote phenotyping, many of those things are things that we are doing already and have done for quite some time. So there's a lot of pros and cons to remote assessment. You can probably imagine the pros. It's a lot maybe cheaper to do things remotely. You can do things in a larger sample size, perhaps because you've saved some of those costs. And families or subjects are in their own familiar environment and space, and so it's perhaps a reduced burden on them. There's no travel involved in participation in a research study, but there are cons related as well. So the video requirements include technology that may not be available to all families. The internet connection, even if they have the technology, could be limited, and they may not have the capacity to do a video type of connection. There are limitations to the types of measures that can be done in that space, and it's uncontrolled. As we were talking about before the seminar started, my dog may bark at a squirrel during this event. So there's lots of variables that we can't control when we're doing things this way. There is, however, a big need to be able to do remote assessments. And so all of us experienced the COVID pandemic and the impact that had on research and clinical care as well, but really this pause that happened, and we all had to pivot to other ways to do our data collection, even though we were not able to bring in research subjects or patients. And what I found and others found as we struggled to do this and make that pivot was that there were actually limited tools that were validated for remote telehealth administration, especially in the cognitive domain. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And even more so for special populations like pediatric populations, rare diseases, individuals with intellectual disability. It was more challenging to find those types of assessments and tools out there. Thinking about the literature, we're lucky that now, looking back, there have been some nice publications. Maybe if it doesn't seem that long ago, but 2019, when we were trying to think about what people had been doing, there was less out there. But now literature is emerging and research is emerging. And so we're able to check the literature and look for what people are doing or what people have experienced. And I just wanted to point your attention, all of your attention, to a special Journal of Autism and Developmental Disabilities special issue that just came out at the end of last year that was all about telehealth opportunities. It was focused on neurodevelopmental disorders, but there's a lot of really great papers in there. It was a whole issue focused on that topic. So what domains of interest would probably capture most everybody's attention for trying to do research in pediatric neuroscience? And I've listed some here. There's others, there's subdomains of these categories, but I think this captures kind of the array of domains that people are hoping and trying to study or include in their research. And the problem is that not every domain is able to be captured as well as others in the remote assessment space. And two that come to my mind immediately are the cognitive or developmental domain and autism spectrum. You can argue that others are equally hard, executive functioning, language functioning, but these two, autism assessment and cognitive assessment, I think have proved to be pretty challenging, especially in the pediatric community space. So I'm going to share with you all just some experiences in a research project that I'm involved with that had to pivot to remote assessment. And this is an IDDRC supported study. It's called the National Brain Gene Registry. And again, it's just an example that I am going to use to illuminate some of the challenges that remote assessment has for our field. And so this project is a combination of 13 IDDRCs. These are the intellectual disabilities research centers that are funded through the NICHD. And this particular project is a UL1 that's a partnership. It's funded by NCATS, and it's in partnership with ClinGen, and it has three big aims. One was to have a standardized phenotyping for these individuals in the registry that have these rare brain genes. Two, it was to curate these rare brain genes because they were selected, but because not much was known about them phenotype-wise. And the third large aim was building a registry that could be easily accessed for the community at large. And so this got funded right around the end of 2019 and started in 2020. And so we immediately had to think about how to do all of the phenotyping remotely. And we came up with, well, we already had this battery, the Remote Development Rapid Neurodevelopmental Assessment Protocol, we call it the RNAP. And this was the wish list that we had for the battery that was in the grant. And so it needed to be standardized. And again, I understand this is for a unique population. These individuals are most likely going to have some level of intellectual disability, but not always. They had to have these rare brain associated genes, but the battery needed to be relevant to a large number of domains, behavioral domains. It had to be flexible enough to fit a broad age range. I was told it had to go from young children to older individuals, certainly adults. Had to at best be low cost. The real wish that it was no cost, free. That wasn't really possible, but keeping things as low cost as possible, off the shelf instruments as much as possible, and that it could be administered by a variety of credentialed level clinicians. And then the last was really thanks to COVID, was that it needed to be remotely administered. So that was a real switch for us. And these were the domains that we tried to cover. So again, these were domains that were of interest to us related to the study of individuals who had these rare brain genes, but they're pretty broad categories. And as you can see, two of those categories are those real challenging ones to assess remotely, cognitive and autistic behaviors. And so these are the domains. I'm going to show you on this next table sort of what we chose. And again, we are doing things as much as possible from what was available and already standardized for the most part. A few of them we had to adapt or modify for remote administration. And so you can see here that the domains are listed there on the left. We've got cognitive, adaptive, autism, motor sensory, psychiatric symptoms, neurologic concerns, and physical features. And then on the right-hand column, you can see generally what type of assessment we're talking about, whether it's a direct assessment, like a telehealth visit assessment, or a caregiver type of report, like a questionnaire. And you can see the instruments that we chose to use. And just to explain it a little bit further, these can kind of be grouped into two different activities. These, again, large batches of questionnaires and caregiver reports that are sent remotely. So this was a little bit of a switch to how some of these instruments were developed, and then a direct assessment that was done via telehealth. And so one of the aspects of the registry that was built was that there was a portal for the investigators at these 13 IDDRCs across the nation, and that was REDCap. And we have completely converted all the questionnaires that were on the previous slide into a REDCap delivered instrument. And again, that is having a little bit of a different modality to how some of them, maybe they were paper and pencil when they were developed and how they were developed, but not a huge stretch different than some of the behavioral assessments. So the behavioral assessments, which we now are having to do over telehealth, those are things that it's sort of observations that the clinician is making over telehealth, often with the input or help of the adult, the parent or the caregiver, if it's the autism-related assessment, or the cooperation of the subject themselves, if it's the cognitive assessment. And these have their own challenges. The grant also had a component of validation. Again, it was written pre-COVID, so it was sort of an in vivo validation because we thought we were going to be doing these in person. And so it had to pivot as well to being sort of a remote examination. And we included aspects of that in the validation scheme that we're now following. So the grant proposed sort of a passive intake of data. Part of the project includes collecting gold standard diagnostic evaluations of all of these subjects. And so what we were hoping to do was demonstrate concurrent validity from some of the data coming from the RNAP. So for example, the cognitive scores, or the cognitive estimate rather, from the RNAP, would that align with research or a clinical report with a cognitive full scale score? We've since added a more active validation cohort at our UNC site, where we are recruiting subjects that we know for sure have a neurodevelopmental disorder and a clinical assessment. They don't necessarily have to have one of these brain genes to be enrolled. They're enrolled specifically for the purpose of completing the RNAP to do this validation. And that piece is ongoing now. And then we also had to include, we had some feedback from some of our IDDRC sites that they had larger populations with Spanish-speaking subjects, and they wanted to be able to do the RNAP in Spanish. So we were then asked to convert basically the RNAP into Spanish, which was another large task. And we have completed that. So we now have converted the REDCap materials. All those questionnaires and forms are now in Spanish. And the administration guidelines that we're able to deliver are in Spanish, as well as the consents. And that Spanish data collection has begun this year. And so I think one message just to have people take away from this conversation is that I think remote assessment is here to stay. There's constantly, I think now, a lot of focus on this. And so new measures are being developed with telehealth in mind. There's validation efforts that are underway, much like the one that I explained with our brain gene registry, but others are ongoing. Clinical care, for those of you that have been following the news about insurance providers and whether they will continue to allow charges for telehealth visits, that's, I think, going to continue. At what level and which provider, that can be a little more nuanced, but I think clinical care is going to continue to have a telehealth option, at least for some types of visits. And test publishers have stepped up, and they've started to offer online portals for delivery and assessment through their publishing or their websites. And so there's a lot of positives and a lot of potential. I'm going to just outline a few of those that we just mentioned on that slide. But so, for example, the two big publishers, Pearson and WPS, have online systems active now. Not every assessment that they offer is able to be delivered, but they do have some instruments that are available, of course, for purchase. They often include the scoring systems as well, but there are quite a lot more materials available now than even a couple of years ago. And I believe Pearson, but also WPS, I think they both have some very nice resources for clinicians or others about guidelines for how to set up a telehealth visit, some nice practice tips and parameters and questions and considerations. So they've both stepped up. Other publishers and other tests have as well, but I just showed these as two examples. I wanted to point out that remote phenotyping brings equity to the ability to phenotype or to assess populations or subjects. It really expands in these ways. It really expands the potential for increasing the geographic range of your study or a study that's happening. You don't really need to care so much about location, although maybe you do need to care about time zone. It really reduces the cost of travel. So in your research budgets for expenditures, you're not having to factor in research assistants traveling to subject homes or subjects traveling to you. It is able, therefore, to be a little easier for some of these rare disease syndromes or more medically involved individuals, subjects, to participate because of that lack of need to travel. It includes where you are able to get translations, other languages. So in the example that I gave you, for example, Spanish translated batteries. And I think it's been something that clinical trials have been very interested in including because of that, decreased travel burden on families. I think it also provides a lot of opportunities for young early stage investigators. And the reason for that is because it does let you sort of expand your budget without having those travel costs and maybe some of those subject related expenses. And I think it improves the ability to do cross-site collaborations and have mentoring across sites where you could have data collected at 2 sites and have more consultation in that way. And because there are still a lot of questions that we need to dig into related to remote assessment, I think that actually opens the door for a lot of new questions and scientific inquiries for these junior investigators and trainees to help us figure out. And this probably is obvious, but I just thought I would state it, that it really broadens the scope and scale of being able to do a project. You can really expand the numbers in your study. There's a lot of phenotyping that could be done, for example, with genetic studies where there may be a really large distribution. You need to be able to cover a large geographic area to get your large numbers of subjects that you might be needed. And things like a rare disease network or clinical trials or other types of repositories, I think would really benefit from this ability to do remote assessment. So maybe just to move into some next steps and some actions that we could all think about taking next. I think there is still the need to do validation for either the approach, if you've modified something, or to think about using this type of assessment with special populations. So for example, medically challenged, maybe motor sensory involved individuals, or if you have, for example, very young or very old populations that aren't able to do technology. And so you're having to think about that a little bit more carefully. I think another thing that we can do as a community of investigators is to think about how to help our colleagues by kind of curating, if you will, the information that we know about remote assessment, and maybe produce white papers like that JADD special issue, something like that, review papers to help ourselves learn from each other about what works, what doesn't work. And then obviously develop new measures or modify existing measures and practices for telehealth will help everyone as well. And I just wanted to provide a brief example of a group that I know. It's an R21KL2 funded enterprise by Megan Talbot. And she had a project where she got funded to look at a telehealth evaluation of the development of young infants, 6 to 30 months, looking specifically at their social and communication skills, and followed their developmental trajectories. And she created this brief assessment, the TEDDY, that she is looking at these ages. They are going through with parents these little play activities. You can see at the bottom the measures that she's including. But I think this is a great example of the types of studies that would help us and inform us and create new measures and then validate them and provide us with some more information about how they work with these different populations. And this is just a schematic of what her study entails in terms of she has some pilot data. She's looking at the feasibility of this with a slightly larger group and doing this telehealth visit to then also bring them back in and see how they look in person. And this is ongoing right now, this particular study. So I thought I would illuminate that. Another work in progress, if you will, I wanted to mention is the IDDRCs have clinical translational cores. Each of the centers have a core, and then the larger IDDRC network has a clinical translational core. And I think Melissa Parisi and Tracy King have been real advocates for getting us all together. And this is a work group that exists right now. We've been working, we're called the Remote Cognitive Behavioral Work Group, but working to try to discuss some of these issues for the IDDRC population. And so it's a volunteer effort, but what sort of our two main goals are is to curate what's out there. And we kind of think about together what we know, if we know of new instruments being developed, or if we know of things that are being modified or used for telehealth, and evaluate whether we think that they're valid for use in this format, and particularly for our IDD populations, whether they might work for nonverbal subjects or not, other languages being available, that sort of thing. So we're kind of curating and evaluating what's out there in this work group. But I think other institutes and other groups could certainly do the same, and I think that would benefit everyone. This particular work group is aiming to do a white paper and share what we have learned. And then the IDDRC remote phenotyping work group, which is a slightly different work group, has been putting on brown bags that have all been focused on remote phenotyping. And so I just am showing you an example from, I'm sorry to say this isn't one that's coming up. It was one from last year. And then there's one from the fall, but you can see the topics are things that might be very interesting to other clinicians and investigators. These are currently existing on an IDDRC Teams network channel, but the plan is to put these recordings on a website so that they are accessible to all. And that is my last slide, and I think I have time for questions. I tried to save plenty of that because, again, that is my favorite part, is to hear the input of my colleagues and others. Hey, Adam, well, should I stop sharing?
Yeah, if you want to, it's up to you.
Sure, I can always pull back my slides if people have a question directly about them.
So we're going to start the Q&A period. That was absolutely fantastic. And so if you want, there's the Q&A tab on the lower tab that you can see. It says Q&A. So so the first thing that we wanted to announce, Heather, I told you there was going to be a little bit of a surprise here that we didn't tell you about before, but we're going to announce it now. NIH is going to be holding a multi-day virtual workshop on remote assessments coming up in the fall. It's going to be across the age spectrum, so there's multiple institutes that are involved. Christy and I are the co-chairs of that group, but we have a lot of people from around NIH who are involved in helping to plan that. So stay tuned for details. And so let's start off with the questions. The first question actually relates to the rare diseases, and I hope Eileen doesn't mind that I call her out, but Eileen King is the PI of the DMCC for the Data Monitoring Coordinating Center for the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, and really a fantastic PI. Her question was, would you be willing to share your REDCap data dictionary so that we can consider as we identify standards for the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network for these instruments and questionnaires?
Yeah, well, I would say that my easy answer is sure, but I actually didn't create them. That's actually the Washington University. That's under their AIM, but I am pretty certain that they would be happy to do that. I know that when we were creating our REDCap forms and measures, we looked to the open libraries, open source libraries, to see what was already out there. So we borrowed from, people, things that were out there. And so I'm sure that we are able to share with others the REDCap forms and materials that we have. One of the challenges, I think, that I didn't actually include, but does make some of the cross-study, cross-registry network sharing a little bit more challenging, is that we did have to get, at the beginning of our Brain Gene Registry project, publisher permissions. So if something wasn't freely available in the public domain, and it was, there was a copyright issue, or it was purchased, you had to purchase it, right? We had to get permission from the publisher, just like you would have done with a paper copy of that form, to make use of it, for one, pay for it, for two, and then we also had to get permission, or we informed them that we were converting it into REDCap. We got a lot of agreement. I mean, we were able to put our entire battery into REDCap, so we didn't have any problems there, but it does make a little bit more red tape with cross-project sharing of just the whole database or the forms, because a new study or a new network or a database would probably have to negotiate that permission from the publisher for their study. And that's something that I wish, and I think our group is going to try and work to figure this out, how to make that easier going forward, because it is a little bit of a stumbling block to sharing things. And rightly so. I mean, these publishing companies, I mean, that's their product. And so we can't give it away and just have everybody send an email link and get around it. But Eileen, the short answer is we would love to. I'm sure we can do some sharing. I would have to link you to our informatics people at Washington University who are in charge of that. Oh, should I answer the next question or?
Yeah, so I can read it. We have several questions coming in, but the next one is a really specific question. For a study including patients with drug-resistant epilepsy who will undergo epilepsy surgery, we're looking for a remote assessment of naming and working memory, particularly verbal working memory, across the age span, 3 to 75 years. And we looked at the NIH toolbox. However, they will be disabling the ability for remote assessment in the version 3, which will be implemented in 2025. Any suggestions for a short battery to assess naming and working memory over a video call by a qualified psychometrist?
Well, that was a very specific question. And I might have to think about it, but off the top of my head, I can tell you that you'll notice that in that list, there were no NIH toolbox instruments. And I have had that question before, like, hey, where's the NIH toolbox instruments? We would have loved to have used them, but for a couple of reasons, there were some roadblocks there. So not all of the institutes, the IDDRC sites that were part of this network, had access to the NIH toolbox as a software that they had access to. We were worried about the ability, and they could have gotten it, but we were worried about the ability to make it something more accessible at other hospitals or clinics, where we would say, okay, you can do this, but you have to have this other, particular software, NIH toolbox. So we shied away from it for that reason. Not that there aren't some good tasks in there that could have done what we wanted them to do. So if you're able to use something from the NIH toolbox, I think that that's perfectly great. But you also point out another secondary problem, which is in 2025, this remote option is not going to be in there anymore. So, what comes to mind for your particular question, I might have to think about a little bit, but, some of the Wechsler tools, I think immediately of the WASI. It's something that you could potentially modify to be able to be given remotely. Now your question went away, so I can't remember exactly what you were trying to do, but like a digit span type of task.
Verbal naming and working memory.
Like a working memory. The RAML has some tasks that you could think about modifying, but again, I'd have to give it a little bit more thought, but there are some things out there if you are willing to modify some things that I could imagine being administered remotely. And I think that leads to another topic that I didn't really make a slide for, but I thought it would maybe come up. I think all of us as a group of scientists and clinicians have to, validation can mean a lot of different things. And so do we feel comfortable with using instruments like we pulled off the shelf existing questionnaires? We didn't make up the question. We just modified it to be able to deliver it to somebody's email box and have them complete it that way, even though it wasn't standardized as an electronic form, but rather paper pencil. So you could say that form hasn't been validated to be administered over email. Or you could spend your time thinking about some of the other more challenging things like the autism assessment and the cognitive assessments that certainly haven't been robustly validated, not every one of them for every population for remote administration. So I think we're choosing to focus on the things that we feel less confident about. Like we feel like, okay, we don't need to spend a lot of time validating that questionnaire. We would rather spend our time validating the cognitive assessment and the autism assessment, because that's where there's a lot more room for error, quite honestly, and maybe not concurrent validity. So we want to check that out first. Maybe I've drifted off the question topics. Let's see.
No, you're good. You're good.
So
the next question. Was there anything else on that one, Heather? Or you want
No,
to?
I was just
Okay.
was looking to see if I
Yeah.
could find the next question.
So the next, yeah, no, Christy and I'll, don't worry about it, Christy, I'll give them to you. So the next question is can remote phenotyping be used for clinical trials? And I'll just add to that one, you know, what, if you want to comment at all, if you've heard anything from FDA.
Yeah, I'll save room for your comment, but I don't see, you know, why it could not be. So the clinical trials, you know, they need to have something that can be replicated, it's validated, it's reproducible types of data. I think if you're choosing things that are quality, right? And you know, certainly, yes. And for example, I don't have my slides up, but in our battery, one of the domains for the RNAP is adaptive. And we debated what to do for this. And we, at the end of the day, decided that it was going to be really hard to remake the Vineland. And it was going to be really hard to convert the already electronic version of the Vineland into a REDCap version of the Vineland and recode all the scoring underneath it, just so that we could say it was in our REDCap database. So we ended up not doing that. So within our REDCap battery, we don't include the Vineland. We use the Q Global version and the Q Global mechanism for the Vineland. And there are many, many clinical trials that love adaptive behavior measures. So certainly if the clinical trial is interested in adaptive functioning as sort of a marker of change, the Q Global mechanism already exists to be able to deliver and score remotely to a subject or a family's inbox email. And you know, quite honestly, we didn't recreate that because we thought that there would be too many places for us to mess up, and we didn't want to go down that road. And the same is actually true for the ACEBA tools. So these are the child behavior checklist and adult symptom checklist forms. There are some publicly available. We did convert it to REDCap. So we put those forms into REDCap, and then we needed to score them. And so we had a big debate about what should we do, because we could enter in all the tables and all the, you know, standardized scores and make the REDCap form do that for us. Or we could use the ACEBA software sort of outside of the REDCap and pull it back in through a you know, different type of code. And we ended up doing that because we just were too afraid that there would be room for error, and it would sure be terrible to have, you know, be rigidly stuck on using our REDCap scoring only to learn that all of our T-scores were off by 10, you know. So it wasn't worth it to us. So we ended up using the ACEBA scoring software as they wished, and as they, I'm sure, are delighted to let us buy, to score that within our RNAP battery. So I think maybe that's just to say, I know that's a long answer to your short question, but the clinical trials, depending on what you want to use, there's already some tools out there that are readily available, definitely validated. The publishers are supporting them. You can buy them tomorrow and have that available. Depends on what you want to use for your clinical trial.
Okay, I'm going to look at the next question, which is also frequency with conducting this type of phenotyping at home. Like, what is the interval that we should be looking at, or the frequency of being able to do these assessments remotely?
Oh, that's a good question. I think this sounds maybe like a little bit of a cop-out, but it probably depends on what you're looking at. So if you're just looking for behavioral change, some sort of measure of behavior, then you would be able to look, you know, more frequently. If you're trying to assess something like cognitive ability, you would probably want to follow the standard procedures of not repeating the same instrument and basically creating a practice effect so that people, you know, get smarter every time they do it because they've learned how to do all your tricks. So I think that you would want to just follow the same practices that you would do clinically, So it would vary by domain, the frequency. So for example, most behavioral rating scales are set up to be done frequently. You could do them, when you come back 2 weeks later to see your physician about your ADHD treatment plan, right? You can do another checklist about your ADHD symptoms, or maybe your depression symptoms when you go back in, the next month to see your provider about whether that has changed. Those types of instruments, behavioral rating scales, even some functional scales could certainly be repeated frequently. Things that are considered to have practice effects, you would want to not do them as frequently.
Great. Thank you. So what if you're doing, you're testing a child who has autism spectrum and they start having comorbidity with seizures. Some of them, for example, might be just subtle as a staring spell, something like that. How do you do, in the office, it's one thing. How do you do that remotely? Because that's might be somewhat different situation.
Do you mean, Adam, or I guess the person who asked this question, if you were in a remote assessment situation and you noticed a seizure type of activity interfering with that session?
Yeah, how do you handle that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that for the most of our sessions, well, I can't say for the most, but for younger children, usually there's a parent present that's a sort of a willing partner. The autism-related assessments often include observing and rating a play scenario between the parent and the child. And so you wouldn't be in a situation where that child is there having a seizure and nobody's seeing it except you through a screen. Now, we do, for our particular study, we do have the capacity to see adults. But we sort of have a triage. So we have sort of higher functioning individuals that are independent. They feel like they are able to interact by themselves on the computer. And then we have lower functioning individuals that there's still a caregiver present, and they may not be doing any of the interaction on the computer. We may be just observing something. There's, for example, a dysmorphology screen that we need to see them, but they don't actually have to be doing much for us on the computer there on the screen. So I think we would, most of the time, if we were worried about something like that, we would be able to alert a caregiver if there was seizure activity that was concerning to us. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. So in terms of like impact on the testing, like does remote testing make that easier? So for example, someone has a, regular, motor seizure with impaired awareness, you could say, and they're postictal, so they're postictally tired. You might say, well, come back tomorrow. Do you think that remote assessments make that kind of a rescheduling easier, harder, or is it?
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I think certainly the families that we have seen through the telehealth find it much easier to reschedule. They're more willing to call things off, right, than if they've driven an hour and a half to your clinic and they're like, we're just going to do it. We're here. We're going to power through whatever the assessment day might involve. But I think families are more willing to say, look, this is a terrible day. And for good reasons and bad reasons, if they're sick or they have something like a seizure, postictal state, not a good day to do an assessment, good to reschedule. The same is true if a painter comes to their door and their house all, it's like chaos around, then they also feel comfortable rescheduling. So there's a little bit of good and bad with that rescheduling option. It is much easier for families, though. I think they feel very comfortable and able to do it.
Okay, this next one is pretty easy for you, Heather. How can you sign up to tune into those IDDRC brown bags, or is it a closed group?
Oh, it is not a closed group. And if I could multitask, I would put the link how to sign up on the chat, but I can make sure that information gets sent out somehow. I don't know what to say, Christy or Adam. I don't have it on my fingertips at the moment, but they are not closed. In fact, they like to advertise them and they like to have a crowd. So there might be a little bit of a hiatus right now over the summer. I believe they had the last one already for the spring. And so they should start back up in the fall.
Great. Chris, you want to do the next one since that was so straightforward?
Okay. This comes in as a little more specific. Any suggestion for nonverbal assessments of cognitive function in a population with a neurodegenerative condition that has variable levels of fine motor and expressive language disability, but comparatively relatively preserved receptive language? So they said we have observed some success with the use of the lighter 3 for in-person assessments, but that appears to be very difficult to be applied in a remote setting.
Yeah, I would say that was a really good question. These are exactly the types of questions that we wrestled with, and I wanted to ask other people. So I'll tell you one thing that we considered, and then maybe you can just explore it and see if it would work for you. But we initially, when we were going to be in person doing these assessments, we had chosen or had thought about doing a nonverbal based assessment for cognitive estimate because this population was going to be so heterogeneous. We were going to have some people that might be verbal, some that would be nonverbal, and we wanted to have a measure that could be uniform. And so we were actually going to use Raven's progressive matrices. And the new Ravens, so of course, when we had to pivot to being remote, I was like, okay, we'll just we'll modify it to have a remote delivery. And I went down that road and attempted to have us use that instrument. But the bank of stimuli is kind of iterative, right? So there's probably like 500 images, puzzles, or if you will, the matrices that it pulls from as you're going through and taking the test. So we couldn't quite figure out how to do that. So what we chose to use instead, for better or worse, was the Shipley. And the Shipley nonverbal only subscale. And it goes down to age 7. I am currently, that's one of the projects that we have related to this brain gene registry, about going to evaluate how it stands up to, an actual cognitive assessment. And I don't know how it's going to stand up because we're in the middle of that project, but that was one idea that we had, was to use some sort of matrices type assessment, like a Raven's progressive matrices. I think you mentioned the lighter, but that might be hard to do remotely. But something like that maybe would be something to explore. Something you could display on a screen. The Wisconsin, I'm sorry, not the Wisconsin. The Wechsler scales do have some remote delivery. And so you could check out some of the subscales and see if it would be possible to do some components. I don't know your age range, but that's possible that you could think about doing some of the Wechsler cognitive scales.
So I'm going to throw a question in from us, and then we'll continue going. I was hoping we'd give people a few minutes at the end of the top of the hour to get themselves ready for their 3 o'clock meetings, but this has been fantastic. So the question is, what do you see as being the big gaps? What are the next big things that we need to start thinking about? The unanswered questions in this domain. I know it's a pretty open question, but love your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Adam. Well, I think there is a lot to do. I think that, continuing our efforts to develop tools that are available and easily accessible. So again, there are these barriers and challenges where test developers own everything. And so it's hard to share it and use it, pass it around between different kinds of research, particularly in the cognitive domain. Like, there's just really not a lot of options, as the last question just illuminated. And, sort of at those kind of specialty populations, nonverbal populations, or maybe they have a motor impairment, or they have some ataxia, they can't really use a computer or something. There's definitely a need for sort of some development of options in that domain. Autism symptoms is another domain, although I think there are more people working on that for remote assessment. And then certainly our ability to test and validate those types of instruments, for the populations of interest. And so I think development and validation is sort of a broad category of need. I think having the telehealth option is important for studies going forward. I think it's going to help people be able to do that, but you want to be able to collect good data. So that's kind of a general area of gap. We need more things to be able to have options, and they should be, not behind a firewall, where you can't easily utilize them. Unless you also wanted to make sure that everybody in the US had fiber. That's another big gap. Having good quality internet access is really key for your population. So one of the workarounds that we thought about for that was creating alternative spaces, right? Where you would be able to, if a subject or a family or a community didn't have good internet options, so you really wouldn't be able to do sort of a remote assessment with them, where could they go instead? Like, could they go to their local library and there's a space there that they could, have access to a computer. I know another study that sends a laptop to the family. I mean, that was beyond the scope and scale of our project, but I know other projects that make sure that the family has the technology so that they can do the remote assessment. That's another barrier to some families. Not everybody has a computer, like a tablet or a laptop or a desktop. Many people, say they have access to the internet, but what they're talking about is on their phone. And so some of these instruments that I'm talking about being delivered remotely, you actually need a screen that's not like a little tiny screen. You want to be able to have a large enough screen that they can see a stimulus page or something like that being projected in a big enough space that it's not interfering with their ability to respond because it's so tiny. So, access to technology and good technology is important, so that there's not a barrier to participation in research.
Great. I think we're going to have time for a couple more questions. Chris, do you want to?
Yeah, there are some more here. We may not be able to get to all of these at this point, but there's one that was asked about how do you or have you had to navigate any barriers related to copyright when adapting measures for REDCap? I know you said you had to contact publishers to get this permission, but I think a related issue for that for investigators is how to factor in costs and what happened when you said we really want to use a REDCap administration. But I'm assuming that then people who are willing to allow you to do this didn't say, and we'll give it to you for free since you're not going to be using any of our materials.
They definitely did not say that. So what we had to do was basically anticipate approximately how many of these administrations, let's just say, for example, with WPS, it was the SRS, the Social Responsiveness Scale. About how many of those social responsiveness scales would we need to, have delivered electronically? They did let us have some wiggle room about the age, like if we used a few more child than adult or, but we had to give them sort of a ballpark number. We needed 1,000, and they charged us for that. And again, we did get the permissions to convert it to REDCap and score it within REDCap. And these are the things that make it less easy to just share with another group without knowing that they also have paid for those materials so that they don't get in trouble for using things inappropriately and dip into those copyright issues. But yeah, too bad it's not all free, but it's not all free. I don't know if did I fully answer that question? We tried to drift away from copyright issues by making sure we were upfront in getting things that we had to pay for paid for and permission to convert to REDCap where we could.
I'll just follow up with a tiny question on that. Did that add any time in terms of startup and preparation for when you could start collecting data?
Oh, yeah, good question, Christy. It certainly did. I mean, it sort of got rolled into all the time that we had to sort of recreate our battery for remote. So maybe it just blurred all together, but it certainly would have added extra time. It wasn't a large amount of time. I mean, it would probably be something you could plan on doing in the span of getting your consents approved. Dealing with the publishers wasn't that slow. It sort of like probably was at the same speed as institutional, review board speed. But you would have to factor it in as a startup, task.
Great. So there was one thing that one of our attendees mentioned, ACL, which is the Administration for Community Living, National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, currently competing a 5-year project for $500,000 per year for improving methods for conducting research with people with cognitive disabilities in virtual environments. So that's something for everyone to look out for. So with that, I think
screen capture of that. That's a great opportunity. Yeah. Thank you. Whoever wrote that, that's great.
It is. Chris, you want to close us out?
Sure. I just wanted to thank Heather for this terrific presentation and for the opportunity to ask questions. It was really informative for us. And I want to remind everybody that the session was recorded and will be transcribed and archived for anybody on the NINDS website. So if you missed any information in the coming week or so, you should look for that to be available, and details about where to find the archived version will be posted on social media and our professional listservs and newsletters. And I'll also ask everybody to look forward to getting more information about our multi-day workshop, which will continue to explore this issue of remote assessment of cognition in populations with neurodevelopmental or neurological disorders, and look for it sometime later this year.
Thank you all very much. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and look out for the next Challenges in Pediatric Neuroscience Research webinars. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again. Thanks.
Bye.